Today we are looking at one of the newer Bitcoin sidechain proposals called Spacechains. And at first glance, a one-way peg seems a bit crazy, but the more you dig in, I think there's some really elegant design choices being made here that make this very much worthy of discussion. Let's jump in. Welcome back to another video. My name is Ian Major. I'm an entrepreneur, Bitcoin pleb, and all-around raging capitalist. I'm excited to take a closer look today at Ruben Somsen's Spacechains proposal, which is one of several different types of Bitcoin sidechain methods. And so we'll talk today about what the motivation is behind any of this. Why is this important? Why is permissionless innovation on Bitcoin important for that matter? And then we'll get into some of the details on how this works. What are some of the design choices? So you're not going to want to miss a thing. For those returning to the channel, welcome back, my friends, as always. It is a pleasure to have you. And for those new to the channel, I welcome you as well. If you like this type of content, I invite you to consider subscribing and join us in our growing merry gang in cyberspace. I cover all manner of Bitcoin-related content, including a whole slew of tutorials on how to acquire Bitcoin, how to secure it, privacy best practices, running your own node, as well as deep dives into various Bitcoin innovation topics, such as today's video. You want it, I cover it. That is how this all works. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the meat for today. And we will start, as I mentioned, with just a bit of motivation for why any of this matters in the first place. All right, so the overarching goal here is really permissionless innovation on or around Bitcoin. The idea being, can we extend some of the use cases that we can do with Bitcoin, as well as can we scale blockspace? Because as we know, blockspace is very limited, and that is very much by design. And one of the common philosophies behind a Bitcoin sidechain, and it is very much the one shared by Ruben in the case of Spacechains, is how do we build this in a way that benefits Bitcoin only, right? I sympathize with the fact that Bitcoin script is sort of purposefully simple so as to minimize attack surface. And thus you've had a lot of users go to ecosystems like Ethereum and others to do, other kind of use cases. And while there's an entire kind of moral argument that altcoins, depending on how they were pre-mined or not pre-mined, right, there's a moral argument in some of those cases. I generally tend to not favor that moral argument that much, right? I mean, the free market is ultimately the free market. If people want to spin up other blockchains with altcoins that others then flock their life savings into, it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. There's also a more practical argument that to do these additional things, I simply don't want to muck around with this completely separate altcoin, which, oh, by the way, a majority of its value is speculative in nature, right? Even in the case of Ethereum, which you have to admit is impressive in the context of the user fees that it generates. But even then, right, the token value, this gas token, is massively speculative. And that's not what you want as a user. You don't want your gas token to be mostly speculative in nature. You really just want it to be used for what it's used for, i.e. paying for computation and paying for block space. And look, that is one of the trade-offs. I think the market has pretty abundantly demonstrated that the introduction of this kind of speculative altcoin is a way to bootstrap a network. We need simply to observe something like the very low usage on a sidechain like Liquid and compare that to, other chains that facilitate similar use cases to realize that man, it's unfortunate, but human nature and this desire to speculate and this desire for greed and to make money is a way to attract people to what you're doing. With all that aside, again, I think there's a very kind of rational argument to be made that, look, I just don't want to muck around with that. So the concept of a Bitcoin sidechain has been around for many, many years. And the idea of even something like merge mining has been around since even the time before Satoshi vanished. This idea of kind of extending hash power to secure not just the Bitcoin main chain, but perhaps a parallel chain, i.e. sidechain. And so while there have been different sort of design proposals, ultimately there are a couple key common factors. There is some way for me to validate transferring value across these two chains. This is typically conducted with something called a SPV proof, simple payment verification. And that is basically saying, hey, look, if I deposit my Bitcoin into this particular address and I therefore get the same amount of, let's say, RBTC or LBTC in the case of Liquid, there's a verifiable way that process happens. And then the idea is that I can do whatever I want within the sidechain. There can be other consensus rules that don't have to follow the rules of Bitcoin, which helps unlock these additional use cases in addition to ideally creating additional block space. And then the other common component is the peg. So when I'm pegging into the sidechain, again, I'm typically depositing Bitcoin into some sort of address, and I'm receiving then the tokens on the sidechain. Then the question is that a one-way peg in which I don't actually get, the Bitcoin back, and I'm kind of, forever within the sort of sidechain ecosystem, or a two-way peg where, I can throw that process in reverse. Now, the first of those common elements is much, much easier than the latter, right? Accomplishing a truly trustless two-way peg is something that has proved rather elusive. And so if you look out into the space today, you have things like Rootstock, you have things like Liquid as operating sidechains that are ultimately federated in some way, shape, or form. Particularly Liquid. Rootstock or RSK has moved in a very encouraging direction away from kind of federation. But what I mean by that is, let's take Liquid as an example. Basically what happens is that your Bitcoin is held in a multi-sig owned by a federation of trusted members, right? These are different, entities, exchanges, different things like that. And so when you have LBTC that you want to convert back into Bitcoin through this peg out process, you are basically asking for permission, right? And so the federation in theory could do malicious things, but you can see why this can be a non-starter for some folks because that peg out process is not very trustless. Now there's another type of approach called drive chain. This is something that has been spearheaded by Paul Sestoric. I always mispronounce his last name, but this is codified in BIP 300 and 301. I've done a whole video on drive chain, so I'd encourage you to check that out. And I'll probably do a comparison video at some point, kind of comparing and contrasting some of these different methods. Drive chain, I think, is really interesting because it uses this concept of hash rate escrow to ideally make that peg out process much more trustless. Now, there are some trade-offs even with that, namely a very lengthy withdrawal window given how this hash rate escrow works. So again, check that video out for more detail if you are curious. But one of the other potential concerns that Ruben in kind of the Spacechains camp raises in terms of this design is that there is a risk or potential for miners to actually steal coins as part of this hash rate escrow process. Now, Paul would argue that there are incentives that prevent this. I think Ruben's point is basically that, well, this is possible. And so just the fact that it's possible makes this an unattractive choice, or at least a non-ideal choice. And there could also be implications for main chain consensus. Like imagine that actually did happen. Miners kind of made off with, some of the funds. Like the only recourse there would be some sort of user activated soft fork to try and essentially cut that fraudulent withdrawal out of the true state of the chain, as it were. And that would be very, very messy and very, very bad. So again, I think Ruben's point is like, why do that if that's even a remote possibility? And there are some other design choices that I won't go into in this video, but basically Spacechains comes in and says, we're just going to do a one-way peg. That's it. We're going to remove all of this potential additional risk as it relates to a two-way peg, given that we cannot really satisfactorily make it fully trustless without introducing some of these risks. And so we're just going to do a one-way peg. And the initial reaction to that may be, that sounds crazy. Like who would possibly want to not be able to get their Bitcoin back? And while that is a huge limitation that I think would certainly limit the desirability and usefulness of this, there is some logic here. So let's dig now into what are Spacechains. Okay, so the two really big kind of concepts behind Spacechains are number one, blind merge mining, as well as this kind of perpetual one-way peg. Merge mining has been around for quite some time. This is the idea that I, as a miner, can extend my hash rate to also secure a parallel chain. The potential issue with that, it requires me as a miner to not just run my Bitcoin node, but also the node for that sidechain. So blind merge mining comes in and says, well, look, like really the miner doesn't actually have to care that much about the construction of blocks on this sidechain. They can merely do a bit of hashing on block headers and like that's sort of it. And so you can have someone else worry about the block creation on the sidechain. And so that is the idea of blind merge mining. Now, Ruben has built on this concept with a pretty cheeky mechanism that makes it so that not only do miners not have to care about what all these space chains are, but there is just simply no need for a soft fork of any kind, at least an incremental one that would be required to support this. And that's a really important distinction versus something like Drive Chain that we discussed earlier. And so how this mechanism works at a high level is that there is a particular special UTXO that anyone can spend. And there's also time locks on this to ensure that it can only be spent once and only once every Bitcoin block. Any individual can potentially spend this particular output. Now, what is this magical output? Well, it basically serves as a bidding mechanism using RBF, or replace by fee, which is a dynamic in which individuals can increase or change the fees associated with a particular transaction. And so we'll look at this anatomy more closely in just a moment and really break it down in more detail. But basically, the kind of auction winner essentially earns the right to write a hash onto the Bitcoin blockchain that connects to a block on the space chain. And so what's happening here is that the bidder is actually burning Bitcoin. So there is a burn mechanic that essentially serves as the kind of provable sacrifice, as Ruben calls it, in order to reach consensus on the side chain. So I burn 1 Bitcoin trying to bid for this particular UTXO, and I get 1 space coin on the space chain. And so there's some really interesting properties that get thrown off by this. Number one, Bitcoin miners get Bitcoin fees. Now, the winning bidder will get, of course, the space coin, as we discussed, but the Bitcoin miners will get the Bitcoin fees. And, this adds a potential source of demand for block space, which is good for the long-term security budget. In addition, because of this burning mechanism, if you're really bullish on space chains, as a Bitcoin hodler, you don't need to do anything, because the act of burning makes the Bitcoin that is still remaining all the more scarce and valuable. Now, one of the common reactions to this is like, oh my God, burning Bitcoin, like, why would you burn the, scarcest asset on earth? To which Ruben would respond, well, it's like not that big of a deal, right? You don't have to necessarily burn Bitcoin in order to get space coins. Like, you could buy space coins on, some exchange or some type of marketplace. And more recently, he has talked about this potential alternative mechanic. I'm not too privy on the details to this, but instead of burning, you can actually lock up your Bitcoin for, 2+ years, some kind of very, very long time. And that almost serves as like a deferred payment to the future. So you're sort of adding to the future security budget. Again, don't have the real details on how that would actually work in practice, but this is being proposed as a potential alternative to just burning the Bitcoin outright. The other interesting property here is that the resulting space coin really it has no speculative value. In fact, it's really not going to it has no reason to be valued more than a Bitcoin. So it's not competing for store of value in any way, shape, or form, which is one of the really key points of this particular design philosophy. And furthermore, because you can't really meaningfully speculate, there are some small arbitrage things you could do, but because you can't really meaningfully speculate, it's likely that this would be more stable in value, which is good when it comes to its main purpose, just paying for fees on the space chain. So it benefits Bitcoin miners, it benefits Bitcoin hodlers, and it requires no soft fork, which is really, really nice. And while there are other implications, the last one I'll mention here is that it becomes pretty elegant in terms of how a space chain can resolve a potential fork. So looking at this diagram, and again, I'll go through a more detailed example of the linkage between Bitcoin and the space chain in just a moment. But suffice it to say, you've got your Bitcoin blocks along the top row, and then you've got your space chain. You've got space chain 1A, space chain 2A. Now let's say that the next block was actually built not on space chain 2A, but back on space chain 1A, right? So as of BTC 3 block, you have this fork. Well, the fork is resolved very, very easily based on where the next block falls. So because the space chain block linked to Bitcoin block 4 is building on space chain 2B, that's it. That becomes the chain. So reaching consensus and resolving potential issues is actually quite elegant and straightforward with this design approach. So let's take a little bit of a closer look into how this actually works with an example transaction. So here we have what's called a covenant transaction. Very, very crudely, this is basically just a sequence of transactions. So you have some initial transaction that then leads into another. And so this blue output, this kind of 500 Satoshis output that we're seeing here, is that sort of reference UTXO, that special UTXO that's just freely spendable. And basically what happens is after someone spends it, they destroy the private key connected to that, such that every incremental block, anyone can come in and spend this particular output. So it's really interesting how that works. Anyway, you have that special UTXO, and then you construct this transaction on the bottom. So CPFP stands for child pay for parent, which basically means that this is going to pay for the covenant transaction as well. All you're really doing here is you're saying, look, I'm going to bid this much for the ability to spend this particular UTXO and earn the right to write a hash in the op return of this transaction. That hash is going to connect to the respective block on the space chain. So that little hash connects to the space chain where you would have the space chain Coinbase that would reward this particular bidder who won the auction to spend that particular UTXO. And then once again, that special UTXO becomes spendable by anyone. Yet again, the private key is destroyed and it is once again freely spendable by anyone, but due to conditions that can be attached to it, it is only spendable once per block. So given how mining algorithms work, right, they're just trying to maximize their fees, the highest bidder is going to win this, and that is going to happen once every single block. So again, that took me a few times to kind of wrap my head around, but again, think of this free-floating UTXO that anyone can identify and freely spend. They're competing and bidding for the right to do that, and as a result of that, they get the right to write this hash, which fundamentally connects the space chain to the Bitcoin blockchain. And in doing so, the fees for that on-chain transaction go to the miner. The rest of what they're bidding gets burned, which benefits hodlers of Bitcoin. And then they themselves get the space coin fees. So pretty interesting. Again, I'm not technical enough to really kind of like assess potential liveness issues. For example, are you really going to have the incentive for people to keep the space chain kind of going and rocking and rolling? But it does seem like with this competitive bidding mechanism, there is an interesting incentive to do that. You could imagine someone bidding like 1 Satoshi for the right to do this. And if there's any utility of any kind in the space chain, then perhaps that would indeed be worthwhile. So on that note, let's talk about what are some of the things that you could actually do with such a design philosophy. And the short answer is quite a lot. This could be very good for asset issuance. You could do stable coins with this. You could do NFTs. You could do different types of tokens. You could have decentralized domain name systems, DNS. This is similar to ENS, right? So when you see all the people with .eth, on their kind of Twitter handle. You could also have just kind of straight up different space chains for different purposes. Like you could have one that's really focused on extremely private transactions. And you could build more complex things like decentralized exchanges, automated market makers, all of these kind of more complex things that require some sort of global state and global consensus, which something like RGB or even Taro aren't going to be able to provide. And so as this diagram illustrates, this is kind of what it could potentially look like, right? You have Bitcoin here in the top center. You have that connected to what might be the overall sort of anchored space chain. And then off of that space chain, right, you can have yet more space chains. So that's why this is particularly interesting, is because that one transaction that gets written onto Bitcoin per Bitcoin block could, in theory, open up an infinite amount of additional block space by virtue of these nested space chains. So you could have a space chain within a space chain. Again, you could have another space chain for confidential assets. You could have another one for some sort of DEX. You could have others for more experimental things. The point is to enable permissionless, voluntary innovation that, one, benefits Bitcoin miners and hodlers, and two, introduces the absolute least amount of incremental complexity or changes required to the underlying Bitcoin consensus. And the Space Chains proposal really does meet that. Now, again, some people are just not going to be able to get over the one-way peg. I'm kind of on the fence with that. I think it really does depend on the actual use cases that are enabled. Again, for achieving those goals and outcomes that we just listed off, Space Chains really is an interesting approach that limits some of the downsides of other approaches such as Drive Chain. Again, I'm sure Paul would, probably argue with that. But even Paul himself, this is back in 2020 when, the kind of idea was very, very first being proposed. His argument is, I think the choice between coins might be stolen, but probably not, and coins immediately destroyed is sort of a no-brainer for a lot of people. But he goes on to say, nonetheless very clever. And his interest, as he states in his first tweet, for the two-way peg is because of his particular interest in things like prediction markets. So in any case, it'll be interesting to see how and if this develops further. Right now, Ruben has, I think, a working kind of demo prototype of how the mining functionality would work on Signet. And so that's linked in his GitHub if you want to take a look yourself, if you are of the more technical variety. But otherwise, as with many of these proposals, there's going to be continued kind of ongoing community discussion back and forth. Again, I think Spacechains is quite unique in that it really does strip away any incremental need for additional features, functionality on Bitcoin Core. And this really is enabled in part by Taproot. So when people say no one's using Taproot, well, that's true to some regard, but that was always kind of expected, right? You were going to have Taproot, and then you would have additional sort of creative design specs like this one that, really do creatively use the Bitcoin scripts. So with all of that, we're going to go ahead and leave this video here. Let's go ahead and conclude today's video. All right, so today we took a closer look at Spacechains, a very interesting proposal for a Bitcoin sidechain that combines blind merge mining with a special little trick, as well as this kind of perpetual one-way peg with burning as a mechanism that enables consensus on this kind of parallel sidechain. We talked about some of the other approaches that have been considered. Take a look in the playlist that I will link in the description down below for some of those examples, as well as others that we didn't even mention. But I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on Spacechains? Do you think they could add value for users of the Bitcoin ecosystem? Or do you think this is all nonsense, and if people want to go use Ethereum for these other use cases, they can just as well go and do that? Leave me your thoughts in the comments down below. I hope you found this valuable and insightful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like, use the share feature down below the video, as that really does help the algorithm get this in front of more people, because I think these are the important topics that we should be discussing as a community. Things like this, things like privacy tools and others. There's always this kind of perception that, oh, there's no innovation on Bitcoin, but that is simply not true. For now, we'll go ahead and leave this video here. As a reminder, every sat counts. And until next time, I'll see you then.